4 years, 3 months, and 6 days since Sarah vanished. The resulting void had swallowed Ethan Vance whole, his savings, his reputation, and his capacity for simple, human contentment. He didn't just lose her, he lost the gravitational center of his life. Ethan Vance had once been a reporter known for tearing the truth out of darkness. Now, he was just a ghost haunting the margins of his own failure, burdened by foreclosure notices and the stench of stale, cheap desperation. He wasn't seeking a scoop, he was seeking an explanation, the terrible, final truth that the police reports and missing person flyers never delivered. He didn't want closure. Closure was a myth invented by those who hadn't truly lost. He wanted the precise physics of her absence explained. The trail had long gone cold, save for one nagging, unresolved detail, the Galleria at Blackwood Creek. The Galleria stood as a brutalist mausoleum of grey concrete and dead ambition, sealed off from the world for a decade after an undisclosed structural collapse scare that everyone knew was simply a quiet corporate death. Its massive facade absorbed light, radiating a cold, stale air even in the height of summer. This sealed tomb was the final, awful waypoint, the last place where Sarah's mundane, living routine had intersected with the structure that had now become his focus 4 years before her disappearance. The security job offered was laughable, minimum wage for maximum isolation, guarding dust, mold, and municipal condemnation. The meager paycheck wasn't the goal, it was the key. He had fabricated his past, blurred the lines of his resume, and managed to convince the skeletal contracting company that he was merely a tired, middle-aged man needing cash. Ethan adjusted the cheap, ill-fitting uniform shirt in the rearview mirror, his reflection gaunt and etched with 4 years of sleepless searching. He reached the service entrance, a heavy steel door marked by graffiti and rust. It was time to get inside. The administrative entrance was a study in sterile menace. Marcus Cole was waiting. Marcus, Ethan instantly decided, was the perfect gatekeeper for a mausoleum. He was thin, precisely angular, and wore the required corporate security uniform with unnatural stiffness. His face was devoid of expression, his eyes 2 chips of polished grey granite. He wore thin, black leather gloves, a detail that struck Ethan as particularly obsessive in the July heat. "Vance," Marcus stated, his voice a low, mechanical monotone that seemed to absorb sound rather than create it. "The contracting agreement is simple. Your job is observance. Not interference. Not investigation. Not curiosity." Marcus simply pressed a laminated card into Ethan's palm, a map of the Galleria's 4 sealed levels, and a list of instructions. "You have been informed the building is sealed due to structural damage and high asbestos levels," Marcus continued. "That is the public truth. The real truth is this: the building is secure because it does not tolerate disturbance." He then proceeded to recite, word for word, the 7 protocols of Blackwood. Protocol 1, you will patrol only the designated perimeter routes. Do not deviate. The center court is off limits between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. Protocol 2, any sustained sound lasting longer than 5 seconds, music, screaming, or conversation, is to be ignored and not investigated. Assume all voices are internal maintenance checks. Protocol 3, the food court is closed. If you smell fresh baked bread, or hear the sound of a cash register ringing, secure your position and focus on the floor tiles until the anomaly ceases. Protocol 4, the main department store entrance, level 3, is sealed with industrial-grade material. It must remain sealed. Do not attempt entry for any reason. Protocol 5, if you observe movement in the reflection of a sealed shop window, do not look behind you. The movement is the window's asset. Protocol 6, avoid the information kiosk after 3:30. If you see someone standing behind the counter, do not make eye contact. They are waiting for a shift change that will never arrive. Protocol 7, this is paramount, Vance. Do not, under any circumstances, search for personal items. Do not search for names. Do not acknowledge any person or item that pertains to your past life. Marcus let the last protocol hang in the air, a silent, specific threat. We have had previous guards fail to adhere, Marcus said, his grey eyes finally meeting Ethan's. The consequence is not dismissal, Vance. The consequence is becoming a permanent asset of the Galleria. You sign your life away when you step inside. Clear, Ethan lied, his jaw tight. He accepted the keys, the weight of the steel a promise of the hell he was about to willingly enter. The moment the thick steel doors clanged shut behind him, sealing Marcus Cole outside, the Galleria came alive in its death. The air inside was thick and cold, carrying the ghosts of failed commerce. The faint, residual scent of cheap department store perfume, mingled with the metallic tang of old pennies, and the deeply ingrained aroma of stale coffee from a defunct cafe. The silence was not empty, it was layered, a dense compression of sounds that shouldn't exist. Ethan began his patrol, the beam of his heavy flashlight cutting weak cones through the cavernous gloom of the central promenade. Then the whispers started. Not true voices, but echoes of intent. He heard the faint, high-pitched ding of a cash register from a store that had been walled off years ago. A sudden, sharp tap of a woman's high heel striking marble, just ahead in the pitch-black curve of the hallway, followed immediately by the rustle of a shopping bag. He gripped the rubberized handle of his flashlight until his knuckles were white, forcing himself to move. He moved toward level 3, ignoring the constant, subtle shift of ambient sounds, until he reached the heavy industrial sheeting that sealed the main entrance of the department store. The violation point for Protocol 4. Ethan drew a heavy-duty crowbar from his belt, a deviation from standard security equipment. The work was brutal, loud, and dangerous. The sound of metal screeching against metal echoed through the empty mall, a terrible violation of the ambient silence. Finally, the sheet tore away from the rusted bolts, creating a hole just large enough for him to squeeze through. He slid into the absolute darkness of the department store. The air here was colder, charged with a heavier sense of dread. The department store was frozen in time. Mannequins stood rigid in styles 2 decades out of date, their plastic smiles mocking the decay. Ethan's flashlight swept across the displays, skipping past the clothes, until the beam snagged on the figure of a central display mannequin. Resting on the mannequin's perfectly tailored lapel, tucked into the fabric, as if deliberately placed, was a small, ornate silver object. Ethan approached, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's. A delicate, Victorian-style silver tram CAI toque she had inherited from her grandmother. Engraved on the back of the small, stylized bird was the initial S. He reached out a trembling hand and plucked the tram from the mannequin. The silver was ice cold. He clutched the tram, crushing the rules, the fear, and the warnings under the immense weight of this single, terrible discovery. He heard the movement then. Not a sound of footsteps, but a shifting of material. A subtle, scraping sound, coming from the next aisle over. The ambient retail hum had ceased. The atmosphere shifted instantly from passive ambience to active menace. The shoppers, as he privately called them, were the strangest phenomenon of the Galleria. They stood in the promenade, looking like mannequins from a distance, but their forms were too fluid, their positions impossibly balanced. And they had no faces, just smooth, ovoid heads that absorbed the light. Now, as Ethan emerged, clutching Sarah's tram, they were moving. They didn't walk, they flowed. Their movement was slow, deliberate, maintaining a precise, terrifying distance of about 40 feet. When he paused, they paused. When he moved, they glided, their collective motion creating that constant, unsettling sound of shifting polyester and velvet. Then, the whispers became personal. Before, the sound was generalized, the ding of the register. Now, it focused entirely on him. It wasn't loud, but it resonated deep inside his skull, bypassing his ears. Ethan, and dang Tim Gio Day. Ethan, what are you looking for here? The voice was faint, reedy, vaguely feminine, and it knew his name. He stumbled, dropping his flashlight momentarily. When he retrieved the light, the shopper near the defunct pretzel stand was closer, gliding in silence. Ko a kong muon and Tim Tai ko a do. Ki li di, Ethan. She doesn't want you to find her. Turn back, Ethan. Ethan pressed the cool, solid silver of the tram into his palm, grounding himself. He broke into a desperate jog, violating Protocol 1 in his rush to reach the core maintenance levels. The shoppers didn't run, they simply increased their glide speed, always maintaining that 30-foot buffer. He reached a heavily marked metal door that led to the utility stairwell. He slammed through it. Silence. The shoppers could not follow him into the utilitarian depths of the building. He knew exactly where he needed to go next, the management office. The lower levels were a labyrinth of pipes, generators, and service tunnels. Ethan used his map to navigate toward the area marked simply Manager, the former administrative offices. The hallway leading to the management suite was noticeably different. It wasn't dusty, it was impeccably clean. The door itself was an ornate, dark wood, secured by a thick, rusted logging chain wrapped multiple times around the handles and locked with a massive, old brass padlock. As Ethan approached the door, he heard the faint, rhythmic sound of keys jingling. A figure emerged from the shadow of a cleaning supply closet. It was Douglas. Douglas was unmistakably a guard, wearing an antiquated, brown uniform that looked at least 20 years old. He was perpetually walking a slow patrol loop, his focus fixed entirely on the polished linoleum floor. His face was pale and slightly blurred, his movements stiff. Douglas didn't look up. He jingled his keys and muttered softly, a stream of rote, nonsensical security commands. Section 3 secure. Check 4B confirmed. Time lock initiated. Perimeter established. Douglas reached the management door, and without deviating his gaze or pausing his patrol, his spectral hand moved toward the brass padlock. The spectral fingers wrapped around the brass lock. The brass simply shifted, and the tumblers within the lock clicked with an impossibly dry, dusty sound. The lock fell open. Douglas didn't acknowledge Ethan. His programmed sequence was complete. The ghost guard flowed past Ethan, the jingling keys receding back toward the cleaning supply closet, repeating, Section 3 secure. Check 4B confirmed. Ethan slid the logging chain off the handle. He pushed the door open and stepped into the nerve center of the Galleria. The management suite was unnervingly functional. Here, the air was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and old printer toner. The room was dominated by a semicircle of ancient, boxy CRT monitors, glowing with the sickly green light of DOS prompts and endless spreadsheets. The computers were running complex inventory algorithms, sales projections, and profit and loss statements. Ethan realized the horrific truth. The mall wasn't simply mauling souls for entertainment, it was employing them. He moved quickly to the central desk, which held a filing cabinet labeled HR Active Assets. He ripped open the drawer, scattering yellowed termination papers. Under S, he pulled a file tagged Vance, Sarah K. The file wasn't thick, but the contents were devastating. It wasn't a death certificate. It was an employee management dossier. Sarah had been officially listed as in-process transfer on the day the mall closed. A handwritten note scribbled across the bottom of the form, dated 4 years ago, read, Asset retained. Reassigned to Perpetual Inventory Audit, Level Manager. Attached to the file was a small, wire-bound journal, Sarah's signature clearly visible on the inside cover. Ethan opened the journal. It wasn't a diary of fear or supernatural horror. It was a logbook. Sarah's elegant handwriting quickly degenerated into frantic, looping scrawls, detailing endless, nonsensical tasks. Day 42, variance in footwear stock 12B. Recalculating loss ratio. The numbers don't match the reality. The reality doesn't exist. Day 180. Marcus says I must finish the Q4 projections before the next sales cycle. There is no sales cycle. Day 1200. I miss the rain. I am tired. I must check the receiving dock manifest. Sarah wasn't dead. She was trapped in the infinite loop of corporate servitude, her spirit condemned to the tedium of managing a phantom business. Her soul had become a proprietary algorithm for the Galleria's eternal operation. Ethan understood the horrible calculus. Saving her did not mean joining her work loop, it meant destroying the loop entirely. He gripped the journal, knowing that his act of love was now fundamentally an act of sabotage. The Galleria sensed the threat to its core operations. The lights in the management suite began to flicker violently. Outside the office, from the central court, a deafening chorus erupted. It was hundreds of trapped voices, the shoppers, the clerks, the previous guards, all screaming the same frantic, overlapping commands: return to your post. Don't touch the files. Sign the contract. The door to the management suite slammed open, shaking the frames of the monitors. Marcus Cole stepped inside, his posture rigid, his grey eyes burning with a furious, unnatural light. Vance, Marcus hissed, his voice no longer a monotone, but a grinding, raw sound that vibrated in Ethan's bones. You are violating every protocol. You are threatening the stability of the entire inventory. Marcus walked slowly toward Ethan. You should have left, Marcus said. But you found the inventory. That means you're suitable for management. Marcus extended his gloved hand. I was the first, he revealed. The site manager. I was trapped here when the deed was signed. I manage the assets now. I am the recruiter. We need new, active minds to feed the loop. Marcus pointed a finger at the central monitor, which now displayed a single, massive spreadsheet labeled Perpetual Inventory. Look, Marcus urged. On the glowing screen, a blurry, translucent figure materialized. It was Sarah, her form outlined in the ghostly green light of the monitor, hunched over an ethereal keyboard, her eyes wide, vacant, locked in the eternal task of auditing the mall's imaginary stock. Stay, Marcus pleaded. Become the new assistant manager. And you will be assigned to the same operational block as Sarah. You will work together. You will be together, auditing, calculating, forever. You save her, and you save yourself. You achieve total, unified purpose. Ethan looked at the spectral form of Sarah, her face etched with the weariness of endless labor. He reached a profound, shattering understanding. This was worse than death. No, Ethan choked out, pushing himself back, slamming Sarah's journal shut. She deserves release. Not a promotion. Marcus's face twisted into an expression of pure, corporate fury. You choose non-compliance. You choose termination. I choose system failure, Ethan declared, grabbing the heavy, ceremonial fire axe mounted on the wall near the door. Ethan didn't hesitate. He knew the backup server room was located deep in the high-voltage sector, marked danger, high capacity. Marcus Cole lunged, shrieking a guttural, inhuman sound that was half static, half rage. Ethan ducked under the attack and burst out of the office, dodging past the shadows of the screaming, amorphous shoppers. He smashed the emergency lock on the high-voltage room door, and plunged into a claustrophobic space filled with the hot, insistent hum of industrial machinery. Thick bundles of fiber optic and power cables, the circulatory system of the Galleria's digital afterlife, ran along the ceiling. He raised the fire axe. You're free, Sarah, he whispered. He brought the axe down with a scream of adrenaline and desperation. The blade bit deep into the primary conduit bundle. Sparks erupted in a blinding, violet flash, accompanied by the deafening sound of overloaded circuits tearing apart. The ensuing scream was immense. It was the sound of a billion spreadsheets being deleted simultaneously, the collective agony of every mandated sales projection crashing to zero. Throughout the Galleria, the supernatural activity ceased. The lights died completely. The shoppers in the upper promenade dissolved, not into dust, but into fine, dark trails of ash that drifted down through the air vents. Ethan heard Marcus Cole's final, echoing cry, a howl of pure terror, as his form was torn between the rigid shape of the guard and a churning vortex of black, digital energy. Ethan scrambled backward, dropping the axe. The room was silent now. He crawled through the service tunnels until he found a ventilation shaft leading outside. He emerged from a rarely used emergency exit ramp just as the faint, exhausted light of dawn touched Blackwood Creek. He was bruised, covered in soot and blood, but alive. He didn't find Sarah, but the image of her face, free from the green glow of the inventory screen, was the only thing that mattered. He had smashed the cage and forced the final release. Ethan walked to his car, his uniform scorched, the silver tram now resting heavily in his palm. He filed a final story. He sent an anonymous email to every major missing persons forum, local news outlet, and digital investigation board. The subject line read, "The Blackwood Creek Spiritual Collapse, Accounting for the Missing." It was a testament. He ensured that the truth, the bizarre, terrifying truth of the Galleria's perpetual employment cycle, would be preserved. The fight was over. He had paid the ultimate price for the truth, and he was finally, utterly, alone. Ethan let the heavy stillness of the security bunker settle around him. Marcus Cole's final words echoed, "You will forget why you were looking for her. That was the real horror, not the perpetual night shift, but the erasure of his purpose." He glanced at the blank black binder, Protocols of Permanent Management a document of his impending failure. His grief was a cold, hard stone in his chest, a counterweight against the creeping corporate apathy the mall promised. He clipped the mag light to his belt, the cold weight a small comfort. The digital display on the handheld glowed, showing the approved route, a clean, looping line that avoided all interesting areas. At 11 p.m. exactly, the screen flashed green, an impersonal signal for the start of his shift, perhaps the start of his eternal sentence. He stepped out of the bunker, the air immediately heavy with the sickly sweet scent of synthetic carpet cleaner and stale popcorn. He wasn't looking for inventory. He was looking for Sarah. Protocol 1 was abandoned within 90 seconds. Instead of turning right into the main atrium as dictated by the absolute route, Ethan veered left, heading toward the older, dimmer wing where the blueprints showed the sealed department store. The standard issue boots made an echoing slap on the polished tile. The temperature dropped sharply the moment he left the designated path, replaced by a humid chill. Then came the music. Faint at first, emanating from nowhere and everywhere. A high-pitched, tinny synthesizer loop, a relentless, upbeat 80s melody, exactly the kind Sarah used to blast while fixing up old furniture. Residual calculation Cole had called it. An auditory lure designed to draw the susceptible deeper into the consumption loop. Ethan gripped the flashlight, sweat cooling on his forehead. He did not slow, did not look for the speaker, and actively fought the urge to remember the specific time Sarah had danced to this song. He focused solely on the exit sign in the distance, a pale green beacon in the manufactured twilight. Ahead, near a shuttered boutique specializing in neon athletic wear, stood the first of the permanent clientele. Two figures, utterly static, clad in acid-wash denim that hadn't seen daylight since 1989. Their posture was one of intense, infinite consideration, hands slightly raised toward the dusty window display. They possessed no faces, just smooth, pale surfaces beneath heavily teased hair. Protocol 3, do not look directly at their head. Do not obstruct their view. Ethan slowed his pace, walking in a wide arc. The silence they maintained was profound, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the corridor. As he passed, he felt a crushing weight of observation, the silent pressure of eternal, unsatisfied need. He kept his gaze locked on their perpetually new, perpetually outdated shoes. They were waiting for something, a sale, a better coupon, perhaps simply the renewal of the economic cycle. He made it past without a sound, the urge to apologize for interrupting their review a surprising, strong impulse. The department store wing was marked not just by a barrier, but by an oppressive, structural silence that swallowed the remnants of the 80s synth pop. The entrance, once a grand, vaulted archway, was now sealed with welded steel plates, reinforced with temporary concrete buttresses, ugly and absolute. Protocol 4. Seal integrity. This was the system's scar, its sensitive history. Ethan ran his gloved hand over the cold metal. He shone the mag light, illuminating the fine seam where the temporary work met the original brass framework. It wasn't a seamless wall, it was an institutional attempt at forgetting, an admission that something here had gone fundamentally, irrecoverably wrong. He pulled the standard security keycard Marcus had given him. He knew the protocol stated the seal * must not be broken *, implying the lock was inert, a psychological deterrent. But corporations loved efficiency. Why waste material on a truly unbreakable barrier, if a simple electronic lock could enforce the rule? He found a discreet, camouflaged reader plate tucked into the brass railing near the old hinge line. He slid the keycard in. The air shuddered. A high-pitched, grinding noise echoed through the mall, a sound like geological plates shifting. The electronic lock didn't click. It groaned in reluctant admission. The concrete seam cracked, and the heavy steel plate slowly, mechanically began to retract inward, revealing an intense, humid darkness and the sharp, overwhelming smell of dust and something metallic, like old pennies. He stepped across the threshold, into the failure point of the Blackwood system. He had violated 4 protocols in under 15 minutes, and Protocol 7 was guiding his every step. He was certain now that he wasn't going home. He raised the mag light into the black void, the narrow beam catching motes of ancient dust. Calling out softly, the name was a defiant prayer in the heart of the closed system. Sarah. The mannequins seemed to hold their breath, dozens of them forming an unnerving semicircle around the display pedestal. Ethan, gripping the silver hairpin tightly in his vest pocket, felt the confirmation of Sarah's presence burn hotter than the fear. He was no longer searching for a ghost, he was tracking a captive, or perhaps, a collaborator. He moved quickly, angling away from the main rotunda, and deeper into the West Wing's dense foliage of consumer goods. The ladies' wear section gave way to linens, then home goods. The merchandise here was undisturbed, stacked with obsessive, impossible precision. Towel racks held perfectly folded sets that looked like concrete blocks. Crystal glassware shimmered with a menacing sharpness under the flashlight's glare, casting spectral rainbows on the dusty carpet. The air conditioning, long dead, left the space stagnant, a museum dedicated to mid-century materialism. Ethan's immediate objective was to find the Starkroom, the place where the real inventory might be logged, rather than merely displayed. He followed the faint smell of industrial solvent, a scent that cut through the old perfume and mothballs, leading him toward the back wall. The saccharine soft rock loop, now playing a badly stretched rendition of a synth ballad, seemed to be emanating directly from the rows of clothes racks themselves, vibrating the cheap polyester. He reached a cluster of 5 empty fitting rooms. The doors were a dark maroon, draped with heavy, oppressive velvet curtains. He swept his light across them, noticing a peculiar consistency. Every mirror in this small alcove was cracked diagonally, but the fragments remained perfectly aligned, as if the damage had been structural rather than accidental. He pushed open the door to the 3rd fitting room. It was tiny, claustrophobic, and utterly bare save for a thin, chrome hook screwed into the wall. As he moved the beam, a glint caught his eye, wedged tightly into the upper corner of the door frame, right where the jamb met the lintel. It was a folded piece of heavy cardstock, almost invisible against the dark wood. Ethan reached up and pried it loose. It wasn't inventory tracking, or a forgotten shopping list. It was a crude, hastily drawn map of the West Wing department store's restricted areas. Drawn in thick, dark pencil, it highlighted not the public floor, but the sublevels, receiving, bulk storage, and maintenance tunnels. A large, anxious circle was drawn around a section labeled, in shaky, almost unreadable script, * the Vault of Eternal Returns *. This map had to be Sarah's. The style of the arrows, the meticulous detailing of the structural columns, it matched the technical sketches she used in her architectural designs. The implication was immediate. She hadn't just been here, she had investigated the layout, and was attempting to document the physical truth of the eternal inventory. A sharp, almost physical pressure descended as Ethan pocketed the map. The music stopped mid-note, collapsing into a prolonged, echoing whine, like a distant generator failing. Then, in the absolute silence that followed, Ethan heard a new sound, sharp and clear, the unmistakable sound of metal wheels turning on concrete, rolling closer. Not the clank-clank of a shopping cart, but something heavier, faster, coming from the direction of the loading bay entrance which Marcus had sealed. He turned toward the fire exit sign, a faded red beacon pointing down a narrow corridor marked staff only. He had his objective, the Vault of Eternal Returns, and he had his entry point. The corridor was tight, smelling strongly of stale grease and dry-rotted electrical wiring. He followed the passage until it terminated at a reinforced steel door marked B1. The door was secured not with padlocks, but with a complex electronic keypad and a heavy rotating wheel lock. It looked less like a mall storage entrance and more like a submarine hatch. As Ethan worked to bypass the keypad with a specialized jumper he'd brought, he noticed a narrow window of reinforced glass set into the steel. He raised his flashlight and peered inside. The subterranean room was vast, high-ceilinged, and filled with towering shelves of boxed goods that stretched into the darkness. But the boxes weren't consumer merchandise. They were uniform, grey metal containers, each stenciled with a unique serial number and a stylized logo he didn't recognize. A closed eye within a dollar sign. More alarmingly, patrolling the narrow aisle visible through the window was a single figure. It wasn't Marcus. This figure was tall and slender, dressed in the severe black blazer and padded shoulders of the mannequin Ethan had seen upstairs, but this one was moving. Its gait was slow, mechanical, and silent. Its face, however, was not the smooth, blank plastic of the display models. It was covered by a tight, translucent mask, beneath which Ethan could just make out the pale, unblinking features of a human being. The entity held a short, black baton and moved with a terrifying sense of purposeful duty, weaving between the eternal inventory. A soft click signaled the defeat of the electronic lock. The rotary wheel remained. Ethan pressed his shoulder against the wheel, groaning as he pushed, the heavy mechanism protesting with a screech of rusted gears. As the final latch disengaged, the figure in the vault stopped its patrol, its masked head snapping toward the door. It made no sound, but the change in its posture radiated absolute, violent attention. Ethan threw his weight against the heavy steel door. It opened inward with a deafening scrape, revealing the cool, dehumidified air of the storage vault. As he stepped across the threshold, the synthetic soft rock music returned in full force, blasting from unseen speakers in the sublevel. A triumphant, distorted anthem welcoming him to the true heart of Blackwood Creek. He was no longer infiltrating a department store, he had entered the factory floor of a nightmare. Ethan Vance held the cheap metal tricolor brooch, the engraved S cold against his thumb. It was proof, undeniable and tangible, amidst the overwhelming concrete and spectral nonsense of the Galleria. He had violated Protocol 4, entering the permanently sealed departments, and the resulting silence was heavier than any alarm. The air itself seemed to breathe in anticipation, a deep, silent intake before a catastrophic scream. He sealed the breach, securing the makeshift lock he had snapped to enter the women's ready-to-wear section. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that his investigation had shifted dimensions. He wasn't just chasing a ghost, he was disrupting an ecosystem. As he moved away from the sealed section and back into the main atrium walkway of the second floor, the shift began. The shoppers had previously been static fixtures of the Galleria's perpetual tableau, mannequins in expired fashion, eternally frozen mid-reach toward a sale sign, or waiting patiently at a cashier's desk that hadn't seen a human transaction in years. They were decorative, eerie, but passive. Now, they were in motion. Ethan first noticed it near the defunct fountain court, an ornate basin where the water had been replaced by a thin, iridescent film of grime. A cluster of 3 figures, clad in stiff denim and high-collared blouses from decades past, were gliding down the marble walkway. They weren't walking, there was no discernible movement of the legs, only a slow, smooth drift, like figures on casters, silent, frictionless, and utterly unnatural. Their lack of faces was the most immediate psychological barrier. Where eyes and mouths should have been, the skin was smooth, featureless, taut like stretched cellophane over a blank canvas. Yet, their clothing was immaculate, unnervingly new, the synthetic fabrics shimmering under the emergency lights, as if freshly removed from the packaging. They represented the eternal, pristine ideal of commerce, preserved by something horrific. Ethan stopped his patrol cadence and pressed himself against the shadowed entryway of an old video rental store. He watched them drift past the shuttered pretzel kiosk. They maintained a perfect, equidistant separation from one another, adhering to an invisible, rhythmic choreography of retail browsing. They were heading toward the western wing, the direction he was supposed to patrol next. He checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. This was not a hallucination induced by sleep deprivation. This was a response. He pulled the collar of his stiff security shirt higher, fighting the primal urge to retreat to the single-lit cubicle of the security station. Retreating meant failure, and failure meant Sarah remained bound to this dead temple of capitalism. The shoppers weren't threatening him physically yet, but their presence was a suffocating pressure. They were the slow tide rising around a solitary rock. When Ethan resumed his patrol, changing his route to the central atrium, the shoppers mirrored his movement almost instantly, emerging from side corridors like iron filings drawn by an invisible magnet. They didn't look at him, they had no eyes to do so, but they tracked his thermal signature, his displacement of air, his sheer presence as something organic and disruptive. This slow, silent stalking continued for the next hour, turning the vast, echoing mall into a claustrophobic maze. Ethan felt their collective, faceless gaze pressing against his back, urging him back toward the exit. Then came the violation of Protocol 2, * never investigate sounds. Sounds are part of the process. * The sounds began subtly, layering themselves over the constant, low-frequency hum of the Galleria's preserved infrastructure. Initially, it was just the familiar distant ring of cash registers and the whisper of music. But as he passed the sealed Gap Kids, a new element cut through the ambient dread, a voice, low and resonant, seemingly speaking directly from the air vent above his head. "Ethan, you are disrupting the transaction." The voice was synthesized, flat, possessing the cadence of a corporate training video narrator. It was genderless, yet filled with an icy displeasure that hit Ethan like a physical wave. He froze, his hand instinctively gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Who's there?" he muttered, knowing the futility of the question. The response came not from the vent, but from the dead payphone bank across the hall, the receiver hook resting firmly in the cradle. "You signed the contract. Protocol 7, compliance is mandatory." The voices were moving, shifting locations faster than Ethan could turn his head. They weren't ghosts moaning for help, they were managers calling out a security breach. He pushed deeper into the 3rd floor, hoping the remoteness would offer some reprieve. Instead, the whispers intensified, targeting the raw wound of his search. He heard Sarah's name, pronounced with a cold, proprietary tone. "The inventory is stable. She is integrated. She doesn't want you to find her, Ethan. She has achieved optimal efficiency." The psychological attack was relentless. They were not merely trying to scare him, they were attempting to rationalize her absence, to present her fate as a benefit, a state of perfect, eternal employment. He remembered Sarah's frustration with her last retail job, her fierce desire to escape the 9-to-5 drudgery. The Galleria had trapped her by granting her the ultimate, horrific form of permanence in the very thing she hated. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to maintain the security guard's slow, rhythmic pace. He refused to run. Running was an admission of guilt, a sign that he was just a terrified man. He had to be Ethan Vance, the infiltrator, the man performing a professional function. False data, Ethan whispered back, purely as an act of defiance, staring down the corridor where 3 shoppers had converged, their faceless bodies reflecting the faint light. Your inventory is incomplete. The Galleria responded with a cacophony of distorted, corporate rage. Hundreds of whispers merged into a shriek of static electricity and recorded pleasantries. Customer service. Customer service is our priority. Why aren't you shopping? Ethan knew the rule, he shouldn't investigate the sound. But he needed information. The voices were feeding him clues wrapped in threats. If they were talking about integration and optimal efficiency, they weren't just storing her memory, they were using her. He realized the shoppers weren't just haunting the mall, they were the mall's defense system. They were the personification of its consumer programming, forced into a never-ending cycle of retail perfection. And they were closing in. He reached the end of the corridor, turning the corner toward the loading dock area, a space Marcus had warned was rife with electrical hazards, Protocol 5. He briefly glanced back. The drifting shoppers had stopped. They formed a neat, silent line spanning the width of the hall, their perfect, new shoes aligned on the ancient tiles. They weren't aggressive, they were patient. They were simply waiting for him to make the next wrong move, knowing that in the Galleria, every minute passed meant another step deeper into the endless cycle of the shift. Ethan gripped his walkie-talkie, but he didn't call Marcus. Marcus wouldn't help him, Marcus was part of the system. Ethan's only path now was forward, into the forbidden zones, to find the engine room of this terrifying, corporate entity and retrieve the piece of Sarah that was trapped within its eternal sales ledger. He headed toward the faint, metallic scent of rust and ozone, moving toward the loading docks, where the forbidden management offices were rumored to be. He had violated 4 protocols, the 5th was calling him. His despair had been replaced by a fierce, focused determination. He would rather be inventory than leave Sarah in the role of eternal clerk. The moving crowd had become unbearable. They were no longer shadows, they were the collective, predatory awareness of the Galleria itself. Ethan pressed his back against the cold, tiled wall of a service corridor, the faint smell of ammonia and stagnant air a welcome reprieve from the phantom perfumes of the main mall. The shoppers, those things clad in cheap polyester and shimmering plastic, their faces blank voids, were slow, methodical, but inexorably closing the distance. Their movement was silent save for the rustle of their outdated garments, a sound like dry leaves skittering across linoleum. He knew he couldn't fight them, nor could he outrun the whole building. He had to breach the absolute core, the old management suites Marcus had warned against. Ethan moved quickly, hugging the perimeter walls, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive gloom. He was searching for the service elevator banks, the kind of forgotten architecture that housed bureaucracy. He found it behind a bank of abandoned ATMs, shielded by a curtain of heavy-duty plastic sheeting bearing the faded logo of a long-defunct security company. The management hall was exactly as Marcus's voice had etched it in his memory, forbidden. A thick steel security door, painted the institutional beige of mid-80s corporate efficiency, was chained shut. Not just a simple lock, but a formidable structure, heavy, rust-pitted links wrapped 3 times around the door handle and secured with an industrial-grade padlock the size of Ethan's fist. The metal protested, groaning under the weight of time, a physical manifestation of the absolute decree, no entry. Kneeling, Ethan examined the lock. It was impossible to pick with the meager tools he carried. He paused, feeling the weight of this definitive barrier. If he couldn't get in, Sarah remained lost to the system. That's when he heard it. It wasn't the sound of the shopping entities, nor the whispers. It was a mundane, rhythmic sound, the click and drag of polished leather soles on hard flooring, the sound of a professional patrolling a route. It was the sound of a human doing his job, utterly out of place in this dead monument to commerce. Ethan killed his flashlight and pressed himself into the shadow of the ATM casing, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. A figure materialized from the shadows near the freight loading dock. It was a man, or the chilling facsimile of one, dressed in an immaculate, if slightly dusty, navy blue security uniform. The brass buttons gleamed faintly in the ambient light filtering from a distant exit sign. This was Douglas. Douglas, one of the failed inventory Marcus had alluded to, moved with a mechanical precision that was deeply unsettling. His eyes, though fixed straight ahead, seemed to look through reality rather than at it. His face was pale, drawn, possessing the texture of old, forgotten parchment. His movements were slow but deliberate, following an invisible grid known only to him. He was performing a security sweep, logging details into a clipboard that materialized and dematerialized slightly as he walked. Ethan had expected a violent banshee, or a screaming shade. He got a bureaucrat. He watched Douglas stop near a service cart, bend down, and meticulously check the date on a carton of expired soda concentrate. He wrote something down, nodded curtly to the empty air, and continued his patrol. His shift was eternal, his duties infinite. Ethan realized the profound horror of Douglas's fate. He hadn't been killed and released, he had been retained. He was running on the last iteration of his daily work schedule, a security guard forced to run the same loop, check the same empty spaces, and log the same meaningless inventory reports for years beyond the closure of the mall. The Galleria hadn't murdered him, it had given him permanent, mandatory overtime. Ethan whispered, trying to break the cycle. Douglas. Hey, Douglas, I need help getting into this office. Douglas walked directly past him, the air around him dropping several degrees, yet he offered no acknowledgement. His voice, when it came, was flat, toneless, and echoing slightly, as if recorded on old tape. Perimeter check complete. All entrances logged and secured. Main concourse humidity levels nominal for Q3 inventory. Ethan felt a grim determination. Douglas was trapped in his programming. He watched the guard's route consistently brought him back to the steel door. Douglas returned, stopping precisely 3 feet from the security door. He reached up and adjusted his collar, a tick Ethan recognized from every middle-aged security guard he'd ever interviewed. Then, the rhythmic movement stopped. The silence was heavier than the surrounding noise of the phantom shoppers. Douglas stood utterly still, his eyes fixed on the chains. Ethan's mind raced. The final, critical task of a night guard closing up the administrative suites was the required inspection. Douglas raised a hand, and in it, a large, antique brass key ring shimmered into existence, weighted with the spectral burden of every lock in the Galleria. Lockdown Protocol 7 Delta initiated, Douglas droned, his voice laced with the painful obligation of duty. Final inspection required before main door securing. The Galleria had trapped Douglas in the perpetual moment before the door was locked. The key duty he was required to perform for all eternity was ensuring the door was open, just for a moment, for the final inspection. Douglas's spectral hands moved toward the industrial padlock. The chains were real, heavy, tangible metal, but the key he held was pure, concentrated adherence to bureaucratic protocol. The brass key slid into the keyhole. There was a screech that sounded less like metal grinding and more like a soul being torn. The lock clicked open with an agonizing finality. Douglas's duty compelled him. He meticulously unwrapped the heavy, rusted chain from the handles, letting it drop to the floor with a deafening metallic clang, the loudest, most real noise Ethan had heard all night. For the briefest fraction of a second, as Douglas stepped aside to allow the required final inspector access, his dead, grey eyes seemed to flicker. They didn't see Ethan, the living man, they saw the abstract placeholder, the required figure to complete Protocol 7 Delta. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slipped past the spectral guard, the air around Douglas humming with cold, unused energy. As Ethan stepped across the threshold, into the darkened, suffocating silence of the management hall, he glanced back. Douglas was already rewrapping the heavy chain around the door handles, the phantom key turning the lock with mechanical, unforgiving precision. The steel door sealed shut. Douglas had fulfilled his function. He had opened the way, completed his programmed task, and now he was sealing the door, locking Ethan inside the core, and locking himself back into his infinite loop outside, forever guarding a door he was constantly obligated to unlock. Ethan was now trapped, locked away from the dangers of the open mall, but sealed inside the administrative heart of the horror. He stood in the absolute dark, knowing that Douglas was the UN living testament to what the Galleria did to its employees. It didn't let them leave. It repurposed their loyalty into endless, meaningless toil. Ethan knew, with chilling certainty, that if he failed, he would soon be adjusting his tie, checking expired soda, and running his own eternal shift alongside Douglas. He turned his flashlight on the interior of the management hall. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient paper. The true inventory began now. The cold, vital hum of the server racks drew his attention like a morbid siren. They occupied a recessed, ventilated alcove near the back wall, bathed in the sickly red glow of status lights. Ethan scrambled out of the chair, his legs stiff, and moved with a purpose that defied the last 4 years of aimless wandering. The time for diplomacy, or even grief, was over. Only destruction could undo the horror he had uncovered. He ripped a heavy metal fire extinguisher bracket from the plasterboard wall, the wrenching sound swallowed immediately by the machine's steady drone. This wasn't sophisticated sabotage, it was violent, desperate demolition. He needed to strike at the physical core of the bureaucracy that had devoured the woman he loved. As he approached the racks, the monitors behind him flashed, the green text suddenly shifting from profit-loss statements to stark, personalized warnings, flashing across every screen in rapid succession. Protocol violation. Access denied. Terminate malicious asset. The metallic scent of ozone sharpened, burning his nostrils. The temperature in the small office plummeted, and the 40-year-old carpet fibers seemed to ripple, vibrating with the sudden, massive surge of computational power. The building was awake, and it was focusing its entire, singular intelligence on him. Ethan raised the bracket, aiming for the uppermost bank of processors, but hesitated as a new text box appeared across Sarah's personalized dashboard. It wasn't the sterile, automated tone of the Blackwood system. The text was jagged, agonizing, and appeared line by line. Please. Don't. If you stop the cycle, I lose the ability to calculate. I won't know how to stop. It's safe here. The structure demands purpose. It was Sarah's voice, not spoken, but typed, desperate and rationalized by the system that had consumed her. She wasn't asking him to save her life. She was begging him not to interrupt her work. The enslavement was complete. She had become her function, terrified of the vacuum of non-purpose. Grief became scorching resolve. I'm freeing you, Sarah, Ethan muttered, his own voice cracking against the electronic monologue. From the sale, from the shift, from the damned ledger. He brought the heavy metal down with crushing force. The first strike hit the rack cabinet with a deafening, vibrating clang, denting the thick casing, but failing to reach the sensitive components within. Sparks flew, smelling like burnt plastic and superheated components. The overhead fluorescent lights shrieked, flickering violently between blinding, painful white, and complete, suffocating darkness. The system's response was instant and brutal. The heavy management office door slammed inward with explosive force, ripping the frame from the wall and sending plaster raining onto the desk. Douglas, the perpetually patrolling guard, stood silhouetted against the dark vastness of the mall corridor. He was no longer shuffling in a hollow trance. His vacant eyes were fixed on the control room, and the heavy, rusty chain he usually carried was now dragging menacingly across the linoleum floor, scraping like a sickle being sharpened. He had been recalled from his phantom rounds. The system had dispatched its maintenance worker. The inventory of souls was fighting back, deploying its oldest, most faithful asset. Ethan did not turn to face him. He raised the metal bracket again, ignoring the spectral heavy footsteps closing fast behind him, the scrape drag of the chain growing louder. He knew he had perhaps 3 seconds before the phantom guard reached him, 3 seconds to land a fatal blow into the humming, malignant heart of the Galleria Blackwood perpetual ledger and inventory. 3 seconds to end Sarah's shift forever. Ethan was already running, his focus absolute, the sounds of the dying mall chasing him into the deepest, darkest core of Blackwood Creek. He plunged into the narrow corridor, the air immediately thicker, heavy with ozone, stale dust, and the biting scent of overworked circuitry. The walls vibrated intensely, a mechanical thrumming that was the building's panicked heartbeat. This was not the polite decay of the rest of the Galleria, this was the raw, hot engine room, smelling strongly of burning rubber and industrial resentment. Marcus's electronic scream faded, replaced by the unified shriek of the phantom shoppers, who could not cross this threshold of pure electrical hazard, their voices pooling behind Ethan like a dam of noise. The flashlight beam danced over sweating pipes and rusted conduits. Ethan followed the deafening hum, the constant, low-frequency buzz that felt less like electricity and more like forced, eternal calculation. He navigated a quick turn, sliding past a stack of desiccated boxes labeled Q4 seasonal decor, and found himself in the heart of the structure. It was a vast, subterranean chamber, the air so hot it burned his lungs. The chamber was lined floor to ceiling with rows of monstrous, beige mainframes, the original 1980s servers that had somehow never been decommissioned, now throbbing with toxic green light. Cables thicker than his arm snaked across the concrete floor like fossilized veins, feeding power and data into the operational hub. This was the nexus where commerce met curse, the core that kept the Galleria alive and required Sarah Vance's soul to run its reconciliation processes. Standing before the central console, a hulking terminal glowing with a feverish intensity, was Marcus Cole. He had finished his grotesque transformation. He was now an impossible shape, a twisting vortex of black oil, shredded polyester, and ancient circuit boards, held together by the sheer, furious necessity of management. "You won't breach the firewall." Marcus shrieked, his voice splitting into hundreds of rapid, tinny bursts, the sound of a printer struggling to process endless debt statements. "The system is self-healing. It requires a general manager for stabilization. You are required to commit." He launched forward, no longer running, but flowing, a tidal wave of liquid retail malice designed to absorb Ethan and finalize his contract permanently. Ethan did not break stride. He knew one blow was all he had. Fighting Marcus was pointless, he was merely the manifestation of the structure. Ethan needed to destroy the commitment itself. He leaped onto a stack of abandoned floor tiles, gaining crucial elevation, and swung the fire axe overhead. Marcus slammed into the platform beneath Ethan, the black oil splashing against the concrete, momentarily seizing the axe handle with a cold, viscous grip. "Join her. Oversee the debt," the manager howled. With a primal yell born of 4 years of agonizing search, Ethan wrenched the axe free and brought it down. He didn't aim for the manager, or the servers flanking the room. He aimed for the central processing unit, the pulsating, glowing heart of the mainframe that held the infinite ledger. The axe struck the core with a deafening, final impact. The result was not an explosion, but an implosion, a soundless, terrifying surrender. A shower of sweet, bitter-smelling sparks erupted, smelling of burnt copper and decades of wasted labor. The thousands of indicator lights on the surrounding mainframes winked out, not gradually, but instantly, like a single, coordinated blackout. In the fraction of a second before total darkness, Ethan saw the monitors flanking the central terminal. Sarah Vance's spectral image, still layered with financial metrics, shuddered violently. Her eternally focused eyes, those blank, stressed spheres fixed on the data, suddenly snapped. They focused on *Kim's star. It was a flash of pure, terrified recognition, a flicker of the vibrant life he remembered. And then, her expression softened, easing into a look of absolute, profound peace, before the image dissolved into static silence. The mechanical thrumming, the high-pitched whine of the servers, the echoes of the ghostly screams, all ceased. The Galleria was no longer operational. The vacuum of sound was absolute, heavy, and immediate. Marcus Cole, the general manager, the cyclone of control, dissolved. He didn't burn or explode. He simply disintegrated into harmless flakes of ash and dust, a defeated algorithm losing its power source. Then, the structural failure began. The floor beneath Ethan's feet began to shift violently, the cessation of the mainframes triggering a catastrophic systemic collapse. The concrete groaned, the steel framework of the Galleria protesting the abrupt termination of its permanent function. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Ethan scrambled off the ruined core, throwing the now useless axe aside. He had to run, not from a haunting, but from a mundane, inevitable structural collapse. He sprinted back into the dark hallway, guided by the memory of the way he came. He ran past the site where the phantom shoppers had clustered. They were gone, their endless transaction cancelled. The management center he had entered moments ago was already twisting, the ceiling beams buckling. He burst into the central atrium, which was a tableau of final defeat. The black, oily substance gushing from the fountain was instantly receding, draining away, as if the structure no longer had the energy to sustain the illusion. The massive marble slabs of the fountain were already cracking under the immense pressure of the collapsed